Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for attending this webinar, which is on the subject of rising to students' learning challenges. So as teachers and also as learners, I think we know that learners face a number of challenges in learning languages. And I think quite an important part of teaching is helping learners to overcome these challenges. So this is really what this webinar is about. We're going to look at what challenges learners face, or some of the challenges that learners face in class. And then I'm going to refer to what I think is quite an interesting document, which was produced by the research team at Cambridge University Press, called Principles of Language Learning, where what they did was they looked at research that had been done in language learning and brought it all together and established a set of principles which could be drawn on in writing course books, in materials writing, but also in teaching and in teacher training. And so we're going to be looking at some of these principles and seeing how we might apply these to help learners to overcome the challenges in the classroom. And in doing this, I'm going to be using some practical examples, which I will take from the second edition of Empower, the new edition of Empower, of which, as Brigitte told you, I am one of the authors. Okay, so we're talking about learners' challenges. So let's start by looking at the learner. Here are some comments that from time to time I've heard from learners. So these are examples, if you like, of challenges. One is, why do we always do the same old thing? So this is really about lack of motivation, about monotony, about the routine of the classroom and the student's attitude to it. A slightly different one, I can't remember the vocabulary we studied last week. And this is to do more with the learning process and retaining information and retaining language input. A very common problem, I think, if you teach at Volkshochschule with older learners, especially. I think this is a major issue. This one is quite similar. How can I remember all those verbs? Perhaps also a response to having to learn things by heart, and possibly also just overload of input, of having too much to learn.
Adrian, excuse me for interrupting, yep. But there's a funny, like a typing sound in the background. That wouldn't be you, would it, or your cat or something?
No, it's not my cat. I hope it's not my speaker. Is that my cord? Is that better?
I think so. Yeah. It was something better? In the background.
I'm sorry. It's interference from the cord. I'll prop it up on the desk. So let me know if it's still there, but I hope it's better. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the last one is slightly different from the others then, and it's more to do with, as you can see, with the students' attitude to learning and attitude to the way the classroom is organised. So these are examples then of typical challenges that learners have. Just to expand on this now, I've got a list here of a range of possible challenges. Could I ask you just to have a look at these and just think of yourself as a learner? Think of your experience as a learner. Maybe you've learned a language at some point, a foreign language, or maybe something else. Could be yoga or IT or cookery, anything you like. And just think, well, which of these things do you find challenging, or have you found most challenging? Just think about this for a few seconds, and if you like, by all means, write numbers in the chat box, or just think about it. Okay, quite a range here, thank you. Okay, quite a concentration on 3, which I can certainly identify with. Let's look at these challenges again, and this time see if you can sort them into 2 groups that make sense to you. So do you think some of them are similar to others and others are different? So just think about this for a moment. Again, type numbers if you like. Okay, this is my answer to that. This is how I would group them. It seems to me that numbers 1, 3 and 4 are all to do with the learning process itself, or sort of cognitive process of learning and managing to absorb information. And 2, 5 and 6, I think, are similar because they are more to do with perhaps the learner's attitude to learning and how they feel about it and motivation. And in fact, we could label them really as under 2 main categories. So I think these ones are to do with cognition, mental process of learning, and these ones are perhaps more to do with engagement, so the learner's attitude to learning and motivation. I'm going to come back to these categories in a minute, and we're going to look in slightly more depth at them. But I'd like to just now shift the focus from the learner to the teacher, because, of course, as teachers, if learners are facing challenges, we want to help. But how do we do that? Or more specifically, how do we decide what to do in our teaching which will help learners? Just to focus on this, I'd like to show you 2 examples of approaches teachers take, 2 different approaches teachers take to try to help their learners with grammar. So teacher A says, well, I present grammar very clearly on the board, then we do lots of practice. Teacher B, I let students work out grammar rules for themselves from the context. You might just think, I'm not going to pause here particularly, but you might just think to yourself, are you more like teacher A? Or are you more like teacher B? Or are you maybe a mixture of the 2? I think I'm a mixture myself. I tend to let students work out grammar rules, then I present the grammar, and then we do the practice. So I think I combine these 2 things. Clearly there's no right or wrong answer to this, but what is an interesting question, I think, is how do we decide which of these approaches we take? Excuse me. Okay. How do we decide what to do? And I think there are various ways in which we can decide. It might be to do with just our gut feeling. Well, you know, it seems to work. It might be to do with our experience in teaching. This is the way I've always done it, always seems to work. Or perhaps this is the way I learned and that seemed to work. It may be, and very importantly, I think, comes from observation or feedback from the learners. So my students seem to enjoy pair work, or perhaps my students tell me they don't want to learn grammar, that kind of information. But also, and perhaps slightly more neglected, we can decide based to some extent on what research tells us or what theory tells us about learning. And in this webinar, we're going to focus a little bit more, or mainly, on this last area of theory and research, and see if we can apply some of the insights from classroom research to making decisions about learning and teaching. So this brings us to these Cambridge Principles of Language Learning, which are about that. They, in fact, identify these same categories that we identified earlier, plus 1 more. So cognition, the learning process, the mental processes, engagement by the learner, and also they talk about learning behaviour, which is more to do with what the learners themselves do to help themselves to learn independently. these are the principles. This is a chart which shows them. I know you can't read this very clearly. It's a screenshot, I'm afraid, but I think you can see that within the principles there are these three main areas of cognition, engagement, and behaviors. And within each category, there are subcategories. So, for example, within cognition, there is cognitive load, there is consolidation, and so on. Obviously, I'm not going to look at all these during this webinar, but I'd like to focus on a few areas which I think are quite interesting. So within the area of cognition, we're going to look at the issue of cognitive load. Within the area of engagement, we're going to look at two specific areas, one of social relatedness, the social dimension, and curiosity. So let's look first of all at cognitive load. With each of these areas, I'm going to look briefly at what research tells us about these areas, so some of the issues, and see how we might apply this to classroom practice. So in cognitive load, here is a here is a quotation from Mackay, who is an applied linguist in California, and this is what she says about cognitive load. There seems to be a consensus in the general second language acquisition literature that cognitive processes that underlie working memory capacity and attention are related. So what she's saying here really is that our working memory, or our short-term memory, if you like, is limited, and it only has a limited capacity. And if we go beyond that capacity, then this affects the student's ability to pay attention. So this is a very important aspect of learning. Just to summarize what research says about this then, is that our working memory, our short-term memory, has limited capacity. If our working memory is overloaded, learning is inhibited, and learners are unable to process new information, and they, as a result, feel overwhelmed and unmotivated. Okay, so what leads then to cognitive overload? Well, obviously a variety of possible things. It may be that simply too much language is focused on in the lesson, or that the language is above level, or there's too much above level language. It may be that the lesson goes immediately from presentation to free practice, so learners don't have a chance to really absorb the new language and to practice it and to become accustomed to it. It may be not the language that's the problem, but the context itself is too complex to get your head round. And it may be that the lesson involves reading and listening texts which are too long and which students get bogged down in. I'm sure we've all had experiences of dealing with texts in class which then go on forever. Students take longer to read them than we expect, and there is cognitive overload from this. And finally, there might simply be too many different activities, too many different stages, too many different things going on in the class. I'd like to just look at an example of a lesson where I think there is too much language focused on, where in fact it leads to cognitive overload. This is a lesson which I haven't taught myself, but I have observed as part of teacher training. It's a lesson from a course book. It's not a Cambridge course book or a TEC course book, I have to say. And this is how the lesson went. As you can see, it was about holidays, and the main language point was going to for future plans. It was an A2 level lesson. And it had about sort of 8 stages, I would say. First of all, students listened to a radio program about travel, and this set the context. Then there was a conversation between two people talking about travel plans. This led to introducing going to and focusing on the meaning of going to and future time expressions like next summer and so on, next year. Then there was pronunciation and controlled practice. Then students read a travel log about travel, with introduced vocabulary for travel, and then they focused on some other phrases for talking about holidays. Then they focused on making suggestions and did an activity about that, and then finally they did a free speaking practice where they talked about their holiday plans. Now, my impression in this lesson was that there was too much language, there were too many stages, and by the end of the lesson students were pretty exhausted and they weren't really taking in the input or able to use the language. Could you just look at this and just think about, well, how could you make this more streamlined? Could you maybe cut out some stages or reduce some stages while still keeping the aim of the lesson? Just pause for a moment here and just have a think about this. This is my take on this. Seems to me that what we've got here is, well, 2 back-to-back listenings at the beginning, which is maybe too much context, I think, before we even get going. And I think there's a question about whether, in fact, this couldn't be introduced in a different way, in a more economical way, or perhaps reduce it to only one piece of listening. Then I think the focus on going to is fine, and the practice is good. It's also a good idea to have a piece of reading to introduce the vocabulary. But if you look at this, you can see at stage 5 there is vocabulary introduced, and then at stage 6 there's more vocabulary introduced, and then at stage 7 there are some more phrases introduced, which I think is a good example of overload. So it seems to me that if I was teaching this lesson, I would be inclined to simply cut out these 2 stages, and I think just stage 5 would be enough, and perhaps give the opportunity to give more practice of this language. In developing Empower and Empower second edition, we were very conscious of the problem of cognitive overload, and we tried to find ways to avoid having overload in the lesson. And so just as a contrast, I'd like to show you an example of an A2 lesson from Empower second edition. Instead of having 8 stages, it's only got 5. And this is what happens. There's a focus on, it's a lesson about food. There's a focus on this guy, Albert Adria, who opened a restaurant in Barcelona, and students read an email describing the lesson. This then leads into a focus on vocabulary. As you can see, not too much. There are 10 items, 5 verbs, 5 adjectives for cooking. Then there's listening, where students, again, not very long listening, where students talk about recipes, they recycle the vocabulary, and this introduces the grammar, which is then focused on, again, not too much grammar, much, many, a lot of, especially how much and how many. And then this leads on to a speaking activity, where students ask each other questions about the food they eat, and they decide whether they think the other person has a healthy diet or not. So I think this is a more manageable language input. So only 5 stages, 1 reading, 1 listening, 1 fairly limited vocabulary with practice, 1 fairly limited grammar section with practice, and some speaking. So a lot of practice at every stage. This perhaps, I think, illustrates how we might make language input manageable. By maintaining a topic focus ongoing through the lesson. So it all leads up to the free activity. By limiting the amount of receptive skills practice, not having overlong texts. Having 1 lexical focus, 1 grammatical focus, and making sure that all the language is practiced. And I think this leads to a greater depth of learning. There's a sense in which with this less is more, isn't it? That rather than trying to teach a lot and not doing much with it, it is maybe better to teach much less and then really exploit the language and give a chance to practice it. Okay, that's an example of how we might apply the idea of avoiding cognitive overload. I'd like to look now at the area of engagement, and in particular to social relatedness. In other words, the social aspect of the classroom and the way students relate to each other. And again, I've got a quotation here from research. This is from H.D. Brown from his book Principles of Language Learning and Teaching. And this is what he says about social relatedness. He says, research suggests that saying a learner has a high willingness to communicate, which he calls WTC for short, must be distinguished from simply describing a learner as extroverted, confident, or risk-taking. One of the key contributors to building willingness to communicate seems to be social support. So what he's saying here really is that, yeah, of course we want our learners to communicate and interact in class, and this involves risk-taking. To some extent, this depends on the learner's personality, but an extremely important factor in this is the level of social support in the group. And I think a very common example of this that comes to mind is, for example, if I think of my own ability in German, I speak fairly fluent German. I'm quite confident in German. I think I do take risks. But I've noticed that, for example, if I'm with somebody who is an English speaker but who speaks better German than I do, I feel inhibited. And I think that I feel they're judging me, even if they're not. So I think that's a good example of how the social context, the other people I'm with, has a strong influence on my own confidence and ability to take risks. And of course, this applies to the classroom as well. So this is what research tells us really about this, is learners need a constructive, supportive learning environment, that learner interaction needs to be comfortable, learners need a safe space to try out new language and to give and receive feedback and to take risks. So what might make things more difficult is probably a classroom like this. In other words, a teacher-centered lesson where everything goes through the teacher, where learners have no opportunity to get to know each other. And I think this is very important, where activities are mainly language focused and not student focused. So language practice exercises rather than students exchanging information and learning more about each other. An example of this that I have is before COVID struck, I decided it would be interesting to try to learn Hungarian. So I joined a Hungarian beginners class at the Volkshochschule. And we had a class, it wasn't like the one in the picture. The teacher was actually very, very supportive and very, very, very friendly. But it was a completely teacher-centered lesson. Everything went through the teacher. And as a result, I found I felt very inhibited about saying anything in Hungarian because I felt I was in a class of strangers. And it was only much later on where we all went out for a drink together after the course and we got to know each other. But of course, by that time, it was too late. Much better if we got to know each other as part of the classroom activity. So what can we do about this is obviously one way is by varying interaction and by finding opportunities for student-centered interaction through pair work and group work, and especially for varying the interaction in relation to the activity. So using a mixture of whole class, pairs, groups, mingling, and so on. Not just for language practice, but so that students can get to know each other as well. Very useful, I think, way of doing this is getting students to repeat activities with new pairs. So they have a conversation with one student, then they repeat the conversation, or they have a new conversation with another student. So they interact with different people. And of course, simply changing pairs and groups frequently in the class. If you think back to this learner we looked at the beginning, who didn't want to work with a student that she didn't know, I think ideally in a class, fairly quickly, all the students would know all the other students, and so this would no longer be a problem. So that's very important. And I think people often think of pair work as being to do with getting more language practice, which of course it is, but there is also a social dimension to this. And I think another purpose of it is for students to start feeling more at ease with each other as well. Another way of developing social relations is clearly through the kind of activities that we use in class, and using activities where there's an opportunity for a personal response, especially where students can talk about their own lives. Here's an example from Empower A2 level, where students talk about events, things they've been to in their town, and also things they haven't been to in their town that they would like to go to, and they find out things from each other. They get language practice doing this, but they also get to know each other. They find out what they have in common with other people. So it has a social dimension. Another example is activities where there is some element of discussion or problem solving, which again enables learners not only to talk, but to get to know each other better. Here's an example from the B1 level of Empower, where students look at jobs from a list. They look at the advantages and disadvantages of them, and then they decide which they think is hardest, which they think is the most interesting. And so in doing this, they find out about each other's opinions, their experiences, and so on. So another way to get to know each other better. And another very important aspect of this, I think, is the language of social interaction. If we want learners to interact with each other, it's obviously going to be very useful and important to teach them the language that they need in order to interact. So just to focus on this a bit, I'd like to show you an example of some expressions which are useful in everyday life, but I think are also useful in the classroom. Just have a look at these and see if you can match them. Very easy task this, I hope, with their functions. What are they used for? So for example, wow, that's incredible, obviously is used for is a way of expressing surprise. Just have a look at them and match the other ones with their functions. If you want to write the answers in the chat, by all means do so. Here are the answers. And if you look down this left-hand column of the different functions, I think you can see that these are useful things to do in everyday life, of course, but they're also useful and important in the classroom. In Empower, we devoted quite a lot of attention to this kind of language, to the language of social interaction and developing learners' speaking strategies. So the third lesson in every unit, in fact, focuses on functional language. And here is an example of a focus on communication strategies, of the language of responding to an opinion from the A2 level, so at a quite simple level. This involves watching a video in which people express opinions and respond to them, and then there's a language focus, which you can see is me neither, me too, you did, do you think so? So expressions like that, which learners then focus on, and they have a chance to practice and incorporate, we hope, into later discussions in the class. Okay, just to summarize then, these are some of the ways of encouraging students to communicate in class and developing this social aspect of the lesson. Varying interaction patterns, but also choosing activities that allow for a personal response, sharing ideas, and focusing on the language of interaction to develop communication strategies for the learners. Okay, that's about social relatedness. Finally, I'd like to look at another area under engagement, which is curiosity and arousing curiosity. And I've got two quotations for you here. The first one is about what leads to curiosity, and this is from Lanina and Chase. This is what they say. Classroom studies show that drawing a student's attention to uncertainty by asking guiding questions to help the student recognize what she doesn't know or pointing out incomplete information, for example, leads to curiosity. So this is actually a rather long-winded way of saying, I think what they're getting at here is that we don't need, or we shouldn't, hand everything to students on a plate. In other words, by allowing students to be able to recognize what they don't know, this leads to curiosity and so to more effective learning. So, for example, eliciting grammar is likely to be more effective than presenting grammar because students are aware of what they don't know in this process. Second quotation, this comes from actually neurological research rather than language learning research. This is from Juhas, and this is what he says about, this is about the effect of curiosity. He says, studies suggest that when our curiosity is piqued, when it's aroused, changes in the brain ready us to learn not only about the subject at hand, but incidental information too. So what he's talking about here is actually some very interesting experiments which were done, which showed that when students were curious about something, they learned more effectively not only about the topic they were curious about, but about other topics too. In other words, curiosity actually gets the brain going, or gets a certain part of the brain moving, which leads to generally more effective learning, which suggests that curiosity is an extremely important part of learning, as well as just being a way of making a lesson more interesting. So this just summarizes, this is what research tells us really. It can be triggered in response to uncertainty, and surprise and mystery can arouse curiosity. So, for example, narrative, texts which are interesting, and so on. And it leads generally to more effective learning. And so it's an important element in the lesson. Let's look at ways of arousing curiosity among the learners. One is, I think, in language input and using guided discovery. And so if you think back to these two teachers earlier, we talked about teacher A and teacher B, there are principal reasons for using guided discovery. And in Empower, in fact, this is the way we introduce grammar largely. Instead of doing grammar presentations, we lead learners towards noticing grammar and finding out about grammar. Here's an example from the B1 level. This is a very short book review of the book To Kill a Mockingbird. This contains examples of present simple passive and past simple passive. And then this leads on to a grammar presentation, but rather than a straight presentation, it's a guided discovery presentation. So students look at sentences, and there are a number of guided questions which lead them towards seeing how the active and passive are different in meaning and also in form. Those of you who have done CELSA courses will be familiar with the idea of concept checking questions, CCQs, and this is more or less the technique that we use in Empower to introduce grammar. So this shows learners what they don't know and what they maybe want to know. Also, of course, we can arouse curiosity through activity types, in particular things like activities which involve guessing and predicting. Here's an example from the upper level, the upper intermediate level of Empower. Learners are going to read about an article about Antarctica. Before they do that, there is a quiz about Antarctica, so they establish what they know, what they don't know about it. And this arouses their curiosity to read the text and find out more about it. Also, of course, visuals are a good way to arouse interest, but it depends what the visual is like, doesn't it? I think often in course books, visuals tend to be very nice, very undemanding visuals, just illustrative. If you look at this, let's look at these pictures. Which ones do you think arouse more curiosity? This one or this one? They're both pictures of a train, commuter train in Japan. But I think it's clear that the second picture is a lot more interesting than the first picture because it tells a story. There's something going on in it. We wonder, who is this guy? Why is he wearing these clothes? What's he going to do? What do the other people in the train think about him? And so on. Whereas the first picture doesn't, in fact, lead to this kind of interest or discussion. What about these two? This picture may be interesting if you're keen on pigeons, but this picture, I think, is more interesting anyway. Again, because there's a kind of story behind it. There are things to look at and wonder about, aren't there? How is this girl feeling? Is she happy? Is she in panic? Is it a mixture of feelings? What's she going to do next? What are the pigeons going to do next? Why is she there? A lot of questions this arouses. So in Empower, we tried as far as possible to make use of this second kind of picture. I think very often teachers bring in interesting pictures into class to arouse curiosity, to make the lesson more interesting. In Empower, we made use of pictures like this at the beginning of every unit. So each unit starts off with an interesting picture for discussion to get students curious and interested. There's one from the elementary level, A2 level, Unit 3, and one from the B1 level, Unit 2. Also important, I think, is using texts which can arouse curiosity. So here's an example in Untitled. You can see this of this is a restaurant in London called the Shed at Dulwich, and as you see, it got very good reviews, 5 stars, and there's a short review about it, with a picture of some very nice food, which seems to be not sure what it is actually. But what is unusual about this restaurant is that it didn't exist at all. It was a hoax. So just somebody who lived in Dulwich. They had a shed in their garden. It was never a restaurant, but he set it up and he got his friends to write reviews of it, and it very quickly became very popular on TripAdvisor. Even the picture is a hoax. I think that picture is actually shaving cream and a dishwasher tab and some egg white and some red paint. So it's not even a meal at all. So that's an example then of a text which arouses curiosity. Restaurant reviews are very common in English language teaching, but this is an example of a restaurant review which is a bit different, which makes students sort of wonder, well, what's going on? How did he do this? What happened? How did he get away with it? And so on. Here's another example. This is from a unit about towns. This is a small town in Alaska. You might look at this and think, well, what do you think from the pictures is unusual about this town? And the answer is that more or less the whole town is inside this one building. So there are flats, there are shops, there's a school, there's a church even, and it's all in one building. Quite practical probably in a very northern climate. Also, there are no roads to the town except through, the only way into the town is through this tunnel and also by sea. So it's a description of a town, but it's a description of a town which is likely to arouse learners' curiosity. And a final example of a surprising story. This is about somebody called a Gator Girl, which you can probably guess is about a girl who works in a holiday park in Florida, and her job is to look after alligators, to work with alligators, and she, as you can see, she gets into the pool with alligators. Okay, it's a text about jobs, but again, it's something that will arouse learners' curiosity, and that you immediately want to know why does she do this job? What does she think of it? Is it dangerous? And so on. So these are examples then of texts which are real. They're real life texts, and I think this is very important that learners can also look these up on Google outside the lesson. They can key them in on Google and they'll find out more about them. So their curiosity can be aroused in the lesson, and it can also be continued outside the lesson, which may be very important if you're teaching not face-to-face in the lesson. And so students can do further research into this. So it's important, I think, that these are also not only interesting and unusual stories, but also real-world stories. So these are some of the ways then in which we can engage learners' curiosity in language input through guided discovery, through various kinds of activities such as problem solving and guessing, and also through context by using interesting visuals which tell a story and human interest narratives real-world stories, and especially stories which are surprising in some way. And as I said earlier, this is not just a way of making the lesson interesting, but it has a really important, I think, and well-founded rationale in improving learners' language learning ability and leading to better and more active learning. Okay, that brings us to the end of this webinar. Here's just a summary of, we ranged over a certain number of different points. This is what we looked at. We looked at some of the learning challenges that we know learners have in the light of the Cambridge Principles of Language Learning, and we looked at how research and theoretical insights can be drawn on and can be matched against our own kind of gut feeling or experience or our intuitive knowledge as teachers. And we looked at these three areas. We had a look at cognitive load, and we saw the importance of learners not being overwhelmed. We looked at social relatedness, and saw the importance of paying attention to the social dimension of learning, as well as the linguistic dimension. And finally, we looked at curiosity and how curiosity is important in stimulating learning. And all of these features are ways, of course, of supporting our students and helping to motivate them and helping to overcome the kind of challenges that we looked at the beginning of this webinar. So that brings us to the end. So thank you very much for listening and for responding, those of you who did in the chat box. If you're interested in finding out more about these Cambridge Principles of Language Learning, here is a reference to a YouTube video about it, or a couple of YouTube videos. I would suggest, however, if you want to get to the YouTube video, the easiest way is probably just key in on Google Cambridge Principles of Language Learning and go to videos, and you'll find a couple of videos on it there.
Thank you,
and
fascinating,
the references,
very interesting input. And just to remind you, all the links will be in the handout that you'll get at the end. And perhaps we can straight away hand over to Tanya. So
that's it. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening.
Telling you something about Empower Second Edition. Thank you. Here she is.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Brigitte, and thank you, Adrian. That was very interesting. It's nice to see. Besides, like, of course, the academical theory, then you actually get to see examples and how it works in practice, which is really great. So thank you very much. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of Empower Second Edition, which was just published. And so first I'm going to give you the overview of the whole series, then we're going to dive into the students' book content, and then we're going to look at the digital components and the publication date. So Empower Second Edition is a general English adult series, is made of 6 levels, so that means that the content covers the levels from A1 to C1. As you can see, A1, A2, and B1 include 12 units. Instead, B2, B1 plus, and C1 are made of 10 units. The minimum teaching hours required to cover the program is 80. However, given the amount of extra material that is there, you can also extend it and stretch it to 120 or even more. And I'll show you how and where to find all the extra material. So these are the new covers, which are really nice and colorful and kind of mirror the pictures that Adrian has shown during his presentation from the unit openers. So that's kind of bright and colorful and gets students like engaged right away. So one reason, there are different reasons why you would like to choose Empower. And one is because the material is engaging, as Adrian has shown to you and as you will see further, and the material is relevant. So the content has been updated. There is new text for reading and listening. So that means that students can relate or list. The material is current. And then, of course, there is a solid assessment part in Empower. And so that means the students feel challenged, they feel they can work towards their own progress, and they also have the evidence of their progress and the scores. And another great reason to choose Empower is that it comes with a brand new digital solution. Empower First Edition already came with a comprehensive digital package, but Empower Second Edition comes with a whole, all device friendly, nice and fresh and up to date digital package. So you will see. Now let's dive into the students' book content. As we've seen, we have a revised design, nice pictures for the openers that get students speaking right away, and of course, updated text and material. However, if you are familiar with the first edition, if you have been using the first edition, you're kind of worried about like, oh my God, I don't really want to switch to a new edition. There's a lot of work. Everything is going to be different. I want to reassure that the structure has remained the same. So no major changes have been made to the base of the book, the structure, the fundamental structure of the book. So the units remain more or less the same. So basically we have a unit opener for those who are not familiar with Empower. So and then we have 4 lessons, and are lesson A, lesson B, lesson C, lesson D. A and B normally focus on grammar and vocabulary, and lesson C is more about speaking. There are videos there that show how to apply the language in the real world. And then there is lesson D that is more about writing, that focuses on writing. And as you can see here in the middle, there are unit progress tests that you can take, the students can take, or mid and end of course tests. And then for each lesson, there is reference to the digital workbook. So there are extra activities that the students can do to practice further the grammar and the vocabulary and more. And I'll talk about more in a minute. And one of the new a new feature that we have added to the second edition is the BBC documentary style video program. So for every unit there is a video from a documentary video from the BBC and relative worksheets. So there is another way that you can expand the learning program, and also that you can engage students, keep them interested. So this is one, and then you can find everything. Everything is downloadable from Cambridge One, the digital platform. An important thing to mention is that Empower Second Edition activities have been mapped out on the Cambridge Life Competencies framework. So the Cambridge Life Competencies framework was designed to develop these life competencies. And for each life competency, there is a core area and a component. So for example, the life competencies are creative thinking, critical thinking, learning to learn, communication, collaboration, social responsibility, and emotional development. And we through our research have shown that these life competencies are crucial for the world of work, for life in general, life in society in general. It's important to develop these, and there are different ways that these can be developed throughout one's life, from the way they are children, from when they are children to when they are adults. But of course, the type of components that create that life skill differ depending on the age. So for each competency, as we said, we have a core area and component, and we have created a brochure that shows in which part of Empower, in which activities these components are developed, in which activities students can work on those components. And these are, as you can see, it's maybe a little small, but everything is clearly mapped out for you. And this brochure can be downloaded for free from our website, and is right there at hand. And we also have a bunch of other material. We have activity cards and so on. Now, let's look at the digital components. So as I said, the platform where everything is Cambridge One. And Cambridge One is our new platform. The digital component used to be on the CLMS. That will retire in July 2024. So the digital component of Empower Second Edition is and will be, as it comes out, on Cambridge One, which is an all device friendly platform. It's browser based. So that means that it can be accessed by all different types of browsers, all different types of devices. But we also have a desktop app, not a mobile app, a desktop app where you can download ebooks, presentation tools, and synchronize your work offline and online. So let's look at what the students get. So for Empower, we have two options. So students can either have the students book with just the ebook or the students book with the digital pack, which I'll tell you what it includes in a second. But the main thing is that the ebook comes as standard. So whether you just buy the ebook or the digital pack, they will have an ebook there with them. And it's all included in the price of the print book. The digital pack includes the ebook with the audio and video, digital workbook, unit progress test, mid and end of course test, class audio, and workbook audio. And those two asterisks are there to mention that these two, the tests can only be taken when assigned by the teacher. So that means that if students are working in self-study mode, unfortunately, they will not be able to take this test. So they will need to be assigned to a class. So you as a teacher will need to create a class and then have the student join the class, and then you can assign these tests. And these tests have to be taken on a laptop or a computer. So these are the only things that cannot be done on a smartphone or a tablet. And also there are videos in the workbook. So there are fun videos like little interviews from locals or foreigners, and it's quite relatable for the students. What the teachers get all the materials. So they get the teacher's book with if you purchase the teacher's book, the coding side will give you access to the digital pack, the class audio, and you will need to request Presentation Plus separately. And you also have the video program included in the teacher's resources. Sorry. Okay, the digital workbook, this is what it looks like. And so basically students can practice further grammar and vocabulary. Everything is auto-marked and students get feedback right away. Then there are the extensions for each skill. So for the reading, for writing, and students can type the answers there. For listening and speaking, and students can record themselves there. So these are extra things that you can do. And the teachers have access to the Gradebook. So that means that you have an overview of what your class is doing, and also what each student is doing, how long it takes them to complete an activity, how many attempts, the first score, the best score. So you can really tailor your teaching, and you can address issues right away when they come. So if you see that somebody has scored, like half of the class has scored very low on something, then you're like, okay, maybe I need to review that. So that helps you, tailor the lesson. And of course, the ebook. So the ebook is there. It's basically has the same layout as a print book. Students can play the audio from there and the video. They cannot complete the activities interactively the same way that they did it with the ebook of the first edition. However, they can use the pen, they can use the notes to keep everything on the ebook. The assessment part, I think I mentioned this, that they have to be taken on a laptop and a desktop. So when now with the second edition, when they do the assessment, when they do their tests, depending on their scores, they will be redirected to the activities they will need to complete to make up for a low score or something that they have not done so well at. They have not completed with a good score. Then So if you're not familiar with LinguaSkill is a test that can be taken online, and this can be used by employers or can be requested by employers or institutions or future employers or current employers, just to show the level of the students. It's not a certificate, it's just a test. It's a multi-level test. And I'm mentioning LinguaSkill because the tasks in Empower are similar to the LinguaSkill tests. So if students are interested in taking this test, Empower would be a great choice because it prepares them for that test. The components. So the components are these ones. So we have the two versions of the student's book. We have the workbook with answers, the combo, so which means that the book and the workbook are split and together. So you have the first half of the student's book and the workbook in one book, and then the second half of the student's book and workbook in another book. The teacher's book and presentation plus, and the last one needs to be confirmed. So it's there from us, but we need to check. For CLET is still is a maybe. So you need to check with Brigitte later on this. And these are the publication dates. However, you need to consider for the print side, you need to consider a month extra. But most of the levels have been already published. So just to sum up, Empower second edition is an easy-to-use, flexible, provides an easy-to-use, flexible learning environment. Everything is in one place in terms of digital components. We offer full teacher support. The ebook comes as standard and is great for blended solution, for blended learning. The design, the content is up to date, and these documentary style videos adds to what is already there. And most importantly, the students will get to develop their life skills through the activities in the books, and life skills that are crucial for the world of work, higher education, and so on. So this is it from me. If you have any other questions, you can either ask me now or you can email Brigitte.